and thank you for joining us for the first broadcast of this year's Toolkits Poetry live broadcast. I'm joining you from the Wheeler Centre based in Naarm. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional custodians of this land that was stolen and land that has been cared for by First Nations people since time immemorial. It is important that we move across this place with great care and respect, that we recognise the knowledge of this land's First Peoples, and that we acknowledge that the violence of colonialism is ongoing. A few weeks ago, I saw a post from Dja Dja Wurrung artist Neil Morrison, aka Dreaming Now, noting the growing presence of acknowledgements of country in Australia. He made an observation that's been echoed at protests since. While these acknowledgements are of course significant, Neil noticed the importance of putting actions to these words, the importance of standing behind First Nation people and fighting to protect and honour this land. Ultimately, this means showing up. So in Naarm right now, one way in which we can do this is fighting to protect the sacred birthing trees on Jaara Country. So I ask that each of you take a moment to acknowledge the country from which you are tuning in from. I also ask, in the words of Neil Morris, to not let your words be the end of your output, to stand with your word. With this in mind, I'd also like to remind everyone about the global climate strike happening tomorrow, and I'd like to urge you all to participate and consider the ways in which climate crisis is a direct result of colonialism. So my name is Melody Paloma, and I'm the facilitator of Toolkits Poetry, a program that's run by Express Media and Australian Poetry. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Toolkits is an online intensive 12-week program for writers under 30. It provides one-on-one mentorship to guide young writers through the development of new work alongside a series of workshops and presentations. So some of which, like this one, are broadcast live with exciting guest artists like MacCarter and Jacinta. Express Media are an organisation focused on the development of young writers. They produce brilliant programs like Tracks and are the masterminds behind VoiceWorks, the quarterly literary journal for writers under 25. Australian Poetry is the peak body for poetry in Australia. They produce a national festival program as well as a suite of publications. So I'd encourage you all to get involved with both Express Media and Australian Poetry via their websites and subscribe to VoiceWorks and APJ if you can. Toolkits is made possible by our generous funders, the Copyright Agency Cultural Fund, and Toolkits Live is presented by Express Media in partnership with Regional Arts Victoria as part of the Arts Connect series, which is funded by the Federal Government's Regional Arts Fund. So tonight we're very lucky to be joined by both Kent MacCarter and Jacinta Plastria, and the three of us will be in conversation about editing and publishing poetry. So we have Kent MacCarter. Kent MacCarter is a writer and editor based in Castlemaine. Let's see, Castlemaine, I can't do that, can I? Castlemaine, with his wife and son. He's the author of 3 poetry collections in the hungry middle of Here, Sputnik's Cousin, and California Suite, as well as 2 chapbooks, Ribosome Spreadsheet and Polyvinyl Chloride. He was an editor of Joyful Strains, Making Australia Home, a non-fiction collection of diasporic memoir. He's managing editor of Cordite Poetry Review and publisher of Cordite Books. Jacinta Plastria is a poet, editor, publisher and activist who lives, writes and works on Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung country. She has returned recently to writing and publishing poetry. Jacinta is the Chief Executive of the national poetry body Australian Poetry, based here at the Wheeler Centre, whose hub organisations include the Melbourne Office for the UNESCO City of Literature. In this role relevant to Toolkits, she is publisher of a range of annual publications and curates AP's national festival program, which partners with the major and emerging literary festivals around Australia. She's passionate about poetry. So the three of us are going to be in conversation for the next hour or so, but I encourage anyone to tweet your questions at us using the hashtag #EMToolkits, and I can then pass them on. So Cordite and Australian Poetry are certainly 2 pillars of the Australian poetry community. And I thought as a kind of entry point into this discussion, maybe you could each tell us about the various streams each organisation works across.
Okay.
You both produce a large amount of content, both in print and digitally, every year. So maybe you can give us a bit of a rundown.
Sure. Well, to recap what we do, we're a nonprofit literary organization. We've just started our 23rd consecutive year of publishing. We have had a free online journal for those 23 years, and we started doing print books about 5 years ago. It is free, it is quarterly, and each issue contains anywhere between 70 to 100 different contributors. So we have a lot of people coming in through the pages. Frequently, we are an author's first or maybe sometimes second publication. A lot of emerging and a lot of first-time writers mixed together with really established writers. And how that really comes about is the fact that we make selections anonymously from guest editors. So each issue is unique and quite different from the one before and the one previous. So we're kind of known for that atypical publishing model now, but it's served us well. The books are not free, and we are onto our series 4 books. We have 10 books in each series, and it's really been a beneficial way to bring light to the journal, and for the journal to bring light to the book, so they work in tandem with each other. I am the managing editor of the journal for now, the publisher of the books, the CEO of the organization, the janitor. I wear pretty much most hats. However, in my tenure, we've expanded the masthead significantly. Now we have 15 really excellent editors helping me out in putting together the issues, which has been massive, and it only strengthens what we do. So that is a small nutshell of what Cordite Publishing Inc. is all about.
All of the amazing things. You both certainly wear a lot of hats. Just into what happens over at AP.
Yes, so at AP we work with about 300 to 400 poets a year nationally, and from school age right through to elders, both First Nation, First People elders, but also, you know, significant voices who've been in our landscape for many decades, who are writing in their 80s or 90s. So we really cover the full gamut of vocational levels and genres and poetics. Very committed to emerging poets wherever you are in your life spectrum, because emerging is not just young, but generally for us it's under 30s. Very committed to First Peoples, queer voices, black voices, people of colour voices, people of all abilities, experimental work. But again, as I said, like through from quite experimental work, which we commissioned through to more traditional lyric. I think as a national poetry body, it's our mandate to support merit across all these different types of poetry. Really believe in intersectional principled curating in both our publications and our festival programming, which links with our publications. And by that I mean that the guest editors you choose, and Kent's very conscious in this as well, a guest editor for your publication very much shapes its curating. And so our curating is making sure there's an inclusive range of 6 to 7 guest editors a year. So we do the National Poetry Journal twice a year, and that can have up to 100 pages of poetry or new work. It's also in a digital form PDF, so we do it differently from Cordite in terms of our digital content. We do an annual anthology, which is starting a little bit to be seen as kind of a replacement for Best Poems by Black Ink, but I don't like the idea of best of, but yet certainly a highly prestigious, very wide-ranging in terms of poetic anthology each year. And then we do the Tell Me Like You Mean It, which quite a few Toolkits alumni have already been in, and you're probably aware of that. So Melody guest edits that each year. It's 20 reasonably new voices. They might have had a bit of publication, but it's really often one of their first outings. And again, really intersectional principles of a whole range of voices, a whole range of communities, a whole range of stances. And And then we're doing one-offs, like increasingly. So we've got a 140-page currently in production anthology of 10 contemporary Mexican poets. A number of poems by each of them, translated by 2 bilingual Australian-Mexican poets and creatives. And that will be released free on our website as part of Digital Writers Festival. So we're kind of also starting to take in some more bespoke publications. And I guess another thing which is part of our publication program is also making sure, this is a new book by Jessica Wilkinson about a memoir of George Balanchine, the pioneering choreographer of last century. And we also really showcase, like, whether it's through critical articles or articles just linking a range of books together, also try and, as publisher, profile what books are being produced by other publishers. It's absolutely incredible and a privilege to work in this area. And I guess the other thing that I'd only mention is, like, both White Lineage sitting here, that I'm very conscious of developing skill sets in publishing and editing from different communities, so that they start to move up through, and that they're sitting here and not us in a few years. But that is a process.
You're both very busy.
I also just think I'm the general dog's body. Like, I got to, the most important thing about being a publisher is carrying boxes of books to the post office.
Happens all the time.
Yeah.
So part of the reason as well why I'm excited to talk to both of you is that you've both had lengthy and varied careers in editing and publishing across multiple streams and platforms. So I'm wondering how you came not only to poetry, but how you came into editing and publishing as well.
How I came into poetry kind of goes all the way back to about 2000, 2001, when I was living in Chicago, and I had a couple of courses at university and I decided that I wasn't super keen to live in George Bush's America at the time. Little did I know how bad things could actually get. So I decided I would study something of personal interest, poetry, literature abroad, and that's ultimately what got me to the University of Melbourne in 2004. Once I had my master's there, I took up a publishing job at an educational publisher in South Melbourne, and I became involved in the small press network when it first started up. It was called Spunk at the time, SPN now. So that's one of the resident organizations here, and I was their treasurer for a long time. And I pretty much have been in publishing ever since, starting with Cordite now about 12 years ago, I think it was. And with these kind of roles, you are, in terms of editor, there's a number of appellations of editor. There's the curatorial kind, who does that and chases shit up from people. There's the technical editor kind, who specializes in that and chases stuff up from people. And there's many different kinds of editors around. So I do not have the hard-boiled, critical, structural editing chops, but I do have it in the developmental editor and the curational editor. So that's kind of the two versions of that I can speak to. So now it has pretty much become my life. Yeah. And I do enjoy it. It is an awful lot of work, but it's work that I do enjoy. And that's why I'm here today.
Can you explain what you mean by developmental editor?
So, for example, we had a manuscript that I commissioned about 2.5 years ago from a poet who was not a named poet, was nobody's star student, was really just kind of an autodidact poet, and I asked the writer for a manuscript that was put together, sent to me, and I really enjoyed it and saw a lot of potential there. But there was also spots in the manuscript where a section of the poems were perhaps not as strong as the others, and so we kind of looked into why that was, what we could do to fix them, what we should leave in, what we should leave out, how to wipe out cliches that naturally creep into anything. So it's really about building the themes, the narrative, the story, or really the tone of the book and the development. And that's very different from a curational edit, where a guest editor at Cordite would read 300 poems and select 20. That's a lot of work too. And a technical editor, I have probably the greatest amount of respect for is the kind of editor that can take all the rules and style sheets and grammar of a given style and make a book nearly flawless. And I'm very lucky to be married to one of those.
Great.
And
That's handy.
it's very handy. And yeah, it's very handy. Very handy. What about you?
Well, I was thinking, I also want to acknowledge, no, I didn't acknowledge before I spoke, but we kind of went straight in on top of what MP said. I am personally, in my acknowledgements, currently also acknowledging Dja Dja Wurrung land and elders and communities, mob and allies, and also the Yorta Yorta, and there's a lot of intersectional relationships going on there with the Tanya Day inquest and the embassy protest. And I guess the reason I do that is I really do stand with what Melody's saying about standing in your word, and without being too earnest. I think there is something about poets that generally we're radicalised, we're generally resistant to injustice. And I think that in a strange way, so I just want to acknowledge the tremendous protests that are going on at the moment, such courage, and for us all to ally as we can in our words and actions. But it's kind of, I don't think it's drawing too long a bow to say why do so many poets also become involved in the production of poetry by other people and the support collegially of whether it's as a publisher, as an editor, as a mentor. It's almost like there's a spark in you that's about the passion that we all have for poetry, and I think we definitely all share it here, where you don't want to, it's not just about your own work as committed as you are to that, it's also about community, it's also about leading someone on, finding a manuscript that you believe with the right support can go somewhere, without the support it wouldn't. I think it's like a pro bono or civic service impulse on one level. On another level, I think it's activism, where you go, where you have the capacity to impact through many unpaid hours usually, or low paid hours, what your community looks like, and stand up where you think that there are absences or gaps, like what you did with Tell Me Like You Mean It, brings through that very specifically curated book for emerging voices. So I think, for me, it comes from a natural impulse. So I was writing a lot, publishing a lot in my 20s, and it was just, I didn't even think about it. It was just like, we'll just guest edit with something, or then started assisting with publication of books. And I think what then happens as you do it for a longer time, and I'd speak for Kent with this, Jess Wilkinson at Rabbit, Bonnie Cassidy, who's also allied with Cordite, and a range of others, that then you actually have to work out how to boundary supporting other people's work in your own work. So there's kind of a spectrum of contribution. It's just so exciting to assist other people with their work.
But
it's very rewarding.
It's an exciting time as well. Even I've only been in Australia for 15 years, and even in that time, when I first got here, there was still the older white male glaciation period of Australian poetry, which has receded and melted significantly, and it's still very much present, but I have noticed a diminishing of that, which is a good thing, and it's very rewarding to have helped bring that about, even in a relatively short time.
And again,
15 years is hardly even an event in a national literature. It's certainly not an epic, but let's hope it becomes one. And it's my editorial mandate for diversity is shared by all my peers, and how omnipresent that was 20, 30 years ago. I don't know. I wasn't here, but I have a reverse engineered sense that it was not very.
Well, I think even like you're saying a decade ago, and again, I want to intervene and say that I honour those of that demographic who are still producing and contributing horrendously to our community. John Kinsella is an obvious example. And so, and not to turn it into a war, but what's happened is this plurality has emerged from the crumbling of the canon and who directs the canon. And I see something, recently I saw someone being described as a foremost poet, and you just don't even use that language anymore, right? It's become, it's not that it's non-hierarchical, because there are people at different levels. There's just a respect for plurality that's really exploded in the last decade, I think.
Yeah, that's true.
Especially with First Peoples poetry, just going through the roof.
It's interesting, Kent, looking at your articles. I think there's one from quite a while ago on Cordite, and then there's another one in Overland from 2017, getting like a kind of overview of what's happening with presses in Australia, and how much even just in the last 2 years so much has changed and developed, and there's constantly new things emerging all the time.
There was like a really important two words of advice I got from Lou Swin many years ago, and she was part of the Sleepers publisher, which was an indie press, and they put out a number of books, and I forget what the event was, but her advice to young people at the time was start shit, and not as in aggro, but start creating and making new, and there's so much of that going on. Like the Subtin series of books from Sydney, there's all that really organic stuff is happening en masse now, and it's not that that was never there in the past with chapbooks and poetry and trading. Poetry is a unique kind of cottage industry that novelists don't get really to have that privilege. But it's quite fecund in poetry, and now obviously with online it's bountiful, and it's nice to see people are starting things and are creating spaces for their communities that just weren't there before.
Things kind of just happen, don't they? Like you have like a little morsel of an idea, and someone supports you in that idea, and it grows so rapidly, and it becomes.
I know the two men who started Cordite really didn't have any idea in 1996 that it would still be around and still producing to the degree it is, and so you never know what's going to stick around.
Yeah. What do you look for in a good poem?
There you go. I'm still thinking.
I know that's a hard question, but when you're trawling through
things that leap out to me immediately is a writer who's taking some risks. I think, and by risks I mean whether it's in style or topic. I mean, there are humans are remote control driving contraptions on Mars, and a lot of people still insist on writing poetry about their divorces, and so that there's some creativity and adventure in the themes, whether it might be a very formal standard poem, or risk can be taken in terms of style, all those floating lines that lots of my colleagues are scared to death of. So things that really just stand out is what will initially pique my attention, and that's getting back to my comment from before. That's what stood out about this author, who I think had been rejected maybe 10 consecutive times from various Cordite guest editors, and all of those guest editors not being me. But here I liked what I read, and I saw a really interesting, great potential in it, and it kind of goes from there. So I guess that's the first seed of what comes to mind. But what do you think, Jay?
Well, I guess being a publisher, even though I would do technical editing, I keep an arm's length at about the poems we receive, so I don't even read them because that would just get politically difficult anyway. And we get 1,500, like you, poems submitted. So do remember that when you're submitting, like if you're one of 1,500, it's a very competitive reading process. But outside that, just loving poetry so much. I mean, I can talk about, a friend and peer like Jess Wilkinson, who's made this book, Music Made Visible. And I just read it and I'm so excited by every poem, even though I've known her previous work, because it's just, I've never read that before. Never read anything like that before.
No, she's unique.
But I feel like that about a lot of poetry. She's unique, and in terms of her innovation, she's just. But I think that what you're saying is like a very young poet or emerging poet, or wherever they are on the spectrum of their vocational pathway, you read a poem and it surprises you. You haven't heard it before. For me, it will be a set of ideas. It will be formal inversions or playfulness, or people can be working within set boundaries of form, of course, or even ideas, and they're still just so powerfully expressed. But they always teach you something. Like a poem that interests me always teaches me, not just, I'm not talking about craft, although poems teach us about craft. They teach me about meaning and love and life and experience and the sensory world. They're always something, there's a personal transaction that goes on there. And it's an incredible code, like AFL.
I'm uniquely interested in poets that use the page as a canvas and.
You mean the visual aspects?
The visual representation, and maybe there's something in this book that's perhaps willing to put words in boxes or just not necessarily to be 90% or greater focused on the story that they're trying to tell or the narrative or the capture of identity. Those things are important if that's the angle that you're writing, but also to use the page as a canvas. I think it absolutely can be that. And
it's a really beautiful way of describing it. And also, just we're not taking all the discussions down this way, but that would be another example with Jess, her whole book. Maybe you can't see her whole. That's you see that? Yeah. Can I get it? There we go. No. Going that way. Yeah. And then again, she'll have page after page of short lines spread across like on the other side, then full-length lines down a whole page. So, I mean, I think what's also exciting is when you find a poet who's working quite formally and they might have left-hand side, even capitalization, but the ideas are just so radical. Yeah. And then the lineation drops from one idea to the other. Yeah. It's.
Well, they can conceive. They can look quite conservative at the outset, but when you read them, they're everything but. So there are a number of ways to be experimental.
I think that's something that feels quite unique to the Australian poetry community as well, is that people are constantly sort of taking these risks sometimes, and I feel like I am being constantly surprised as well, and that's the thing that I'm always sort of wanting from a poem, is something that surprises me and something that makes me want to go back to it, because poems don't necessarily have to be about something, but there has to be something that makes you want to return to them.
Mm-hmm. You're tipping over the Pandora's box there just a little bit about the poems having to be about something, and that's. I'll be part of a conference soon in Canberra where that very thing will be coming to the fore. What is poetry about? And there will be a diverse panel, and I'm on this panel, obviously waving the avant-garde flag, which I would not label myself, but I know that's why I will be on the panel, kind of discussing what poetry is or isn't or should be or should not be. And, that will be an interesting one.
That's a big question.
I firmly believe that a poem doesn't have to make any sense at all. It doesn't have to have a narrative. It does, great, but it doesn't have to have that.
No.
And I think a number of writers can get really hung up on that And then and in having these kind of conversations, I always just mention, you could kind of think of it in terms of visual art. Like, do you want every piece of amazing visual art to be sweeping wheat fields and farms?
That's what I was going to say before. I saw you said this word canvas, and it's like, I feel like sometimes it's so much easier to approach reading poetry like you would a painting or trying to understand visual art.
I will fully.
It's not necessarily visual, but
I'll fully admit to being very moved by Rothko paintings. Like they're more than life size in person, just with color and the juxtaposition of color without any story can create intense emotion. And I think poetry can do that too, without being about anything. I think it can. At least that's what I try to go for in some of my writing. My writing has plenty of problems otherwise, but that's kind of the direction I go in. Those kind of things leap out of the stack.
Well, it's true, isn't it? I guess another metaphor would be classical ballet, neoclassical, contemporary, fully abstract dance, and that poetry sits in its own versions of that across the whole spectrum. And you can be a classical dancer with incredible technique within that realm, and then be doing some of the most experimental risk-taking work over here as well. And I think that you also just a hunch that a lot of poets with profile, I guess, or emerging profile, are prepared to work across different idioms. They don't just stay in one scene as well. And also, I think the fecundity of what's going on is about the community of publishers that you have. You know, just to name a few: UWAP, Mugabala, of course, at Broome, First Peoples. I don't want to go right through every state and territory. I'll miss people anyway. UQP is doing incredible work. Giramondo, Cordite.
You pretty much said them all, and that speaks to another question.
Salon series, and
and that's something as well that's
like the subbed in. Let's just do that.
Reading at a gallery, and it's what we were talking about before about things.
I was wondering too, like, what do you think about this other idea of publishing? So we're moving more and more into audio publication at AP, where poems that we're publishing will also be recorded, or we have events and they'll be SoundClouded for free access. But also like the kind of publishing that you do of your work, like the beat test and the semaphore. But those interstices between performance, like literally in the physical, and the presentation of work, I mean, that's also a form of publication.
Totally.
Absolutely.
Oh, our lights are going out.
A little bit of mood lighting.
I mean, it totally depends on the work. I was thinking before as well when we were talking about how much is going on in the Australian poetry community, and I do like this idea of events being recorded and accessible online, because I remember being quite intimidated by the Australian poetry community before I started meeting people, because
and then
it is so close, and it's I mean it's totally supportive and great, but it does feel intimidating if you're kind of outside of it. And maybe this also has to do with the fact that poetry publishers are the poetry publishers, and these big publishers aren't necessarily publishing poetry.
No, there is no. Australia's only really got one domestic non-small press, and that's Allen and Unwin. I don't know if they've ever published any poetry, maybe in their history. They have. I don't know, but they certainly don't at the moment.
So that's like 20th century.
And then you get down to the small presses, which is kind of everything else other than Hardy Grant, who also don't do poetry. So you have UQP and UWAP, that two university-related presses, and then beyond that, then you have people who are kind of making it up as they go along, like Punter and Wutman or Vagabond.
So I should mention Vagabond. They're doing incredible bespoke publications at the moment.
Projects that you have done as well with Gloria, and beyond that, there are not a lot of poetry publishers, but I want to reiterate again that it's a really fertile time for people starting new things and creating their own publications their way. And I think that's terrific.
Stale objects is another. There's things happening online that are very exciting as well. How do you learn to edit your own work?
It's a tough one. What do you think?
I think it varies for each person. Like there's certainly some kind of orthodoxy, that's not the right word, but yeah, there's some sort of patterning going on where people, developing a manuscript or a set of poems will have a group of close ones reading it and feedbacking. I hear that all commonly. It might be 4 or 5 readers as it's developing. I think it's happening a lot, and that's great. But then I think there's also that self-editing, which is another relationship to writing. It's part of the act of writing. And some people don't have external editing in any way. Gig Ryan, I'm fairly sure, completely self-edits, has for a long time.
But she's very amenable to reading other people's work, in which she has done of mine. Many times.
That's true.
Editing my own writing, it's kind of a process where I'll have what feels like a good idea and a poem fomenting on the page, and I'll fuss at it and overwork it and ostensibly ruin it. That's kind of the host poem, but from that these various parasites grow, and it's usually those offshoots which are much clearer and more refined and might not have anything to do with the original impetus. Those are the poems that seem to come out at least whole. I do redraft those as well and update them, but that's kind of how my genesis of writing starts. Sometimes that initial idea, I can pull it back from the edge and it's workable, but at least 50% of the time it winds up getting destroyed. But it might produce 2 to 3 other really great poems, or poems that I think are actually what I want them to be. So.
Yeah, sometimes I end up sacrificing a whole poem for a line that ends up finishing another poem.
Absolutely.
And
it's worth
going through that process just for that.
I think it's worth it.
I think also you can think about like initial drafts being very much like studies are in the fine arts. Like you do studies over and over, or you train at bar for 10,000 hours to be able to dance ballet or whatever. You go over and over technically, you've got an idea that you're working with. You might test out some new techniques as well, or work out what suits that poem in terms of things like its place on the page, the use of capitalization or not, the use of the I or not. There's a whole range of decisions we make. But I've been revisiting some work toward a book that I'm writing at the moment, and I'm interested when I go back after some time to see if the edit I thought was final, right? Because I'm trying to finish poems completely and then go to the next poem. I'm not working across them. It's just a particular thing with this current project. It's like the frequency of this is what it seemed to me, the frequency of trying to get a radio channel into absolute clarity. And it's like the poem, like I'm not talking about writing perfect poems, but there's something that I'm starting to be able to sense where it's so crystal clear, it's been totally rarefied to that channel, or it's not, and you can't actually find that channel because there's something fraught around initial conception, or it's beyond your current capacities. Or whatever, but I think you can get too hooked up on wanting to write perfect poems that have no glitching. At the same time, I think other poets are too soft on their work. I think you do have to pressurize your work.
Yes, I see a fair bit of both. It can be overproduced, like an album that's overproduced.
Absolutely,
It just sounds like you're listening to glossiness when what you really want is the raw acoustic sound of the piano and
the other thing I'd say about over editing is, and I've written a bit critically about this sometime in the past now, it's glamorous poetry to me. Yes, it's perfectly perfect in terms of craft. The ideas might even be strong, but there's absolutely no contact between me and that work. It's been it has a chill around it. Whereas other work that might still have things to be resolved in it, emerging voice, or someone trying out something new in their later poetry life that is technically difficult. I have a lot more respect for that as well.
I'm uniquely interested in authors at Cordite Books where the manuscript I'll be interested in will be a complete departure from what they may have done in the past, or maybe they haven't published in a decade or 2 decades.
The use of the word glamour makes me think of the Forbes title, Damaged Glamour.
Yeah.
That's so good.
And glamour is always, from the spiritual perspective, it is. It's like the superficial. It's not. It's an illusion. Yeah. I think it's a really good term.
Yeah. So do you think being a good editor of other people's work makes you a better editor of your own work as well? Because I find being someone else's reader, like I have people that I get to read my work, and I read for other people as well, and I find that a very useful process.
Well, I don't know if it's not even just that you acquiring deeper or more specialised or even more far-reaching technical reading skills. It's not just that, it's just that you're just absorbing and reading more and more poetry. And I think that all practices are informed by engaging with other people's work, not over-engaging, like you've got to respect your own boundaries, but I think it's just inspiring to be exposed to all different kinds of poetics as well. So in that regard, definitely you learn.
I think incidentally and by sheer proximity, my answer is yes, but I also think of all the developmental edits I've done to poetry manuscripts where I am the publisher, which is now nearly 40 books, I don't think any of that has made whatever shred of poetry I've written in the past 5 years better to begin with. I don't actually think it has. But I think what it does say is having external readers look at your work and give feedback is an excellent thing to do, and I dare say a mandatory thing to do.
Yeah, and I think it's important that those readers are different kinds of readers as well.
Absolutely.
And I think an important caveat on that, though, is because it's something that I've learned, and it's something I know other people in our community have had to learn, is be discerning about who you choose. Be discerning about the criticism or feedback that comes back, because you're just asking people to give feedback. It's their opinions, it's not fact.
Listen to it.
And if you have a certain vulnerability around modesty, like perhaps you're an incredibly modest person, or for example, then you might take that on in a way that's actually destructive to your own authentic pathway as a writer. So I think you have to balance it. It is true,
it's a really good and important point that I guess I'm glad you brought it up. And I was hoping it was
because people can also have undeclared. Their feedback isn't going to be helpful to you. And there might be undeclared rivalries, or or other things going on. They may even be unconscious, but I think you really have to.
I think you've got to be very careful about hiring, if you want to pay for it. If you hiring mentors from writing centers. Most writing centers around the country do have a battery of mentors that you can hire, and that's great. But just be sure to look very closely at what that person's body of work is. Will they have anything to unlock or say to you? I mean, will it be worth your time at all? In the past decade, I have been an assessor on a number of grant applications. It's public knowledge anyway, so I'm happy to say it here. And a lot of the applications that we look at where people are paying large sums of money to a mentor are really mismatched. And I think you can kind of get the sense that maybe they felt strong-armed into it, or sold something that ultimately they might not be getting. A mentor is not a panacea. It's there as a sounding board, and you could certainly learn from it, but it won't make your manuscript immediately snap upable to a publisher. It won't do that.
Yeah.
So that's my word to the wise. Be careful about. Definitely share your words, but be very thoughtful about who those people are, just as you said.
Yeah, definitely. And I think engaging in the community as well is its own kind of mentorship in a way. Like I feel like, when I first started going to readings and things, that was really crucial for me, in terms of feeling like I was like mentored and supported in the community.
I think people are very generous. It's really
yeah.
just, it's always that handful of energies that you need to protect your work from.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah,
a learning
absolutely.
process as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great.
So what are the steps then if you feel like you've got a collection, or maybe a chapbook, and maybe you could explain what a chapbook is if for people that don't know?
Well, there's any number of things you can do. A chapbook is just a small book.
I've heard you explain it as like an EP versus an LP.
It is an EP versus an LP.
Yeah.
I think the benchmark in Australia, and again, this is only by the interpretation of government bodies, that a full-length collection of poetry is 40 pages or more, and that's very arbitrary because I've published books that have maybe one word on a page, and so it's
Style objects does work.
Yeah, and so that's quite arbitrary. So a chapbook is just a small short book. At its heart, and they are a currency, and they're traded. And this is what I was saying before about a novelist doesn't really have that sort of currency at their access, which is a boon to poets, because they do. You can print off 50 chapbooks for a very modest price, and you trade them with other writers. It's one thing that poetry has that no other medium does. And that you can do all by yourself. You don't need an ISBN. It doesn't have to be found in a library. If you have, say, 50 word pages of poems that you're really happy with and hang together, then you got yourself a manuscript. That's all it really takes. You don't have to worry about styling it too much. You don't have to worry about page numbering and table of contents and making it look beautiful. That's just a waste of time. Just because it's all going to be redone anyway. Just focus on the poems, and if you have, maybe 30 to 50 that really work, boom, you've got a manuscript. Then what do you want to do with it?
And many people produce chapbooks and then later put that into a full collection.
Yep, absolutely. We're doing a book right now that will have 2 chapbooks and then new work as well. And it does actually all operate nicely together. So
and also to check which publishers are taking open submissions, because some have closed, some don't. They're only commission, word of mouth, or they read someone's work in a journal, or if they're open for submissions, and understand it's quite a long timeline.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And yeah.
Also, I was thinking, you've got Punter and Watman in Sydney, but you've also got Transit Lounges doing some poetry.
They do occasional poetry.
I know they've just done one recently. Wallia in Tasmania.
Wallia Press. If you want to go for something that is a book, ISBN, cover stock, all this, that, the other that you might find in a bookshop in a library, there is a finite number of places to go. There's just no two ways about it, and they do come and go. Sadly, my most recent publisher decided to stop Five Islands Press. It's a real shame to see them go. They put out great work, but something else will crop up again and take its place. But I don't believe you're never going to see Penguin Australia putting out poetry books again. It is incredibly hard to.
Never.
I don't know. Maybe an anthology. Maybe it's hard to say. But doing print runs of, say, 400 copies of experimental poetry, nope. I bet they never will, ever again, unfortunately. But that's Penguin. But that's why you have small presses like Cordite, like Vagabond, and like stuff that you're putting out.
What about ordering a collection? How do you?
It is. I reckon it's almost the hardest art part of it. I think.
You can shuffle the deck in
as
so
an
many
editorial.
ways.
Yeah, whether the poet does it, whether the editor does it in collaboration with the poet, it varies again.
It does vary, and usually the authors I work with have a fairly strong idea about that.
strong.
There have been exceptions. Some of the most well-known poets that I've published have handed over a stack of papers and said, "Here, make something from it." And that's flattering, but it's a lot of work to sift through a huge pile of poems and to figure out what hangs together.
I mean, you've got a whole number of books in any book, depending on ordering, to state the obvious, but it really is. And Plath's Ariel was obviously a really historic example of that, whether it was her own ordering or the one that was perverted by Hughes, and it's a completely different book as a book, not as poems. It's really interesting. I think that one thing I think about editing and is gut instinct. There's something, it's like the same as curating events, creatively producing things as well as publishing. You have an instinct. Like you have an instinct there's a typo as you're about to go to press. You know what I mean? Where's that typo? And you just have this sense. There's something wrong with that poem. But I think ordering is, again, a really sophisticated example of that. It's very instinctive as well as intellectual, don't you think?
I think so too, yeah.
And sometimes poems will fall out on the floor and you go, oh, they're actually meant to go that way.
Definitely have done that. I've printed out poems on paper, which I've recycled, and to visually see them all and to make various groupings of them. I did that with Zenobia Frost's book. We were a little bit unsure of how to sequence it. Liked all the work, but we shuffled it many different ways. And between myself and associate publisher Bella Lee and the author, we got it to a sequence that we liked.
Well, Bella would be very insightful with that. Yes. And what do you think about the idea of dividing books into sequences and suites, or keeping it as a run right through? Again, it's going to depend on.
It really depends on what we get. So the book that we'll be printing, the next two books, the first two of series 4, will not have any sections. It's just going to start and go to the very end. By Prithvi and Mucky Burke. Those are uncommon, but I'm happy to do it if it doesn't really need spatial breaks.
Or conceptual breaks.
Or conceptual breaks.
Periodic breaks.
It kind of depends on what you have to work with.
Because poetry is very open to a unique way of reading as well, and that you still can't really dictate it, because you can often just pick up a book and open it in the middle and read a poem. And people will read it in whatever way they want.
So we're also working on a book that will be sequenced in a way where its intent will be to read it both forwards and backwards, which is a unique challenge.
I like that idea.
Yeah.
That is such a great idea. I was thinking with like sometimes to old school. That's interesting. Old school ways work. Well, I'm a bit old school person, and so I know. So I'm just showing everyone our current journal, 9.1. The theme is resist, and it is meant to be radical in its ideas across all different kinds of resistance. Poetically, 100 pages of new poems, and guest edited by John Kinsella. In the end, we decided to go with alphabetical ordering of the poets, because to have intervened and reordered it non-alphabetically would have been politicised in some way, or John interfering. Specifically, quite a range of First Peoples, culturally diverse, queer voices and other communities, and so it was like that would be he and I imposing. But having said that, before he came to that decision, he's a very conscious, thoughtful editor as well as poet and activist. He had printed them all off, and I would say he was just going to sit on the floor and just just keep working them, and also random, a bit like throwing a dice, working out what fell where. So I think that's
many ways to do it. Yeah.
And I don't want to keep talking about Jess's book, because there's a whole range of other books I've been reading this year that is outstanding, but I read that deliberately backwards.
Did you?
Yeah. So it's chronologically ordered around Balanchine's ballets, which I know some of them and I love them, but I was interested for some reason. I read the forward and then I read it backwards from the last ballet that Balanchine did. And then that suite I'll read forward as well. The whole book's in suites, sorry. But yeah, so I think you're right.
Yeah.
And you don't even know why you do it sometimes with a book. You just have a sense.
Yeah. And there's I feel like I've brought this up here before, but Melinda Buckton in the Poetry Says podcast with Alice Allen. If anyone hasn't listened to that, it's a good poetry podcast to listen to. Talking about sort of unconsciously making mixes of poetry where you've got sort of five books on the go and you're picking them up. And I do the same thing, and I didn't realise it was a weird thing either. But yeah, poetry is very open to unique ways of reading. I think of Lionel Fogarty as well as someone, I feel like Tim Wright's maybe written about this, as being open to non-linear reading practices. Works in a kind of mosaicing.
It's really, it's true. If you think how often you're reading multiple volumes at once and you're not reading at page 1 through to page 50, it's a very long span of attention to read a poetry book closely. It is. It's wonderful. Yeah. Thank you.
So we're nearly out of time. Maybe just as closing question, what are you most excited about and what would you like to see more of?
I'm going to need a moment to think.
Okay. What I'm most excited about is...
Do you think there's anything missing that people should be...
Yeah, what I'm most excited about is just the sheer level of excellence and merit and the volume of poetry being written at that level. What's absent is still hierarchical absences, which are due to colonial structures, around skill sets and privileging certain voices for many times. So that needs to change. And so, like say at AP, we're working with developmental roles where skill sets will sit coevally, like in publishing or in curating, so those skill sets develop quite rapidly, so that those roles then go hierarchically to other communities. Without the great thought thing there has been the gatekeeper, or who's deciding who's doing that and who isn't doing that. But I mean, I think again, if you're standing in an activist and progressive stance that's fierce, you are contributing to the right changes.
I think one thing that is missing is a comprehension of the sheer workload and dedication of what it takes to have a place to publish in. I've noticed in the past 5 years that the Pay the Writers movement, of which I am one, has been loud and successful. Even though getting standard ASA rates is fantasy in poetry. There are, a number of places where you can get paid for your work. But now that Cordite's 23 years in, it started by publishing the final poems of, like Dorothy Hewitt, like the greats from way back, and then the emerging poets at the time, like we published John Mateer's first poems, and those writers are now mature and established. And now we're at a point where we're publishing people who weren't even born yet when the magazine started. And it's in kind of that cohort where there's an assumption that Cordite is just a permanent fixture in Australian literature, and it will always be around, and it will always have money. And I think there's some disconnect in understanding how much it takes to keep those things going, which you would know very
well. So I think if there's something that's missing, it's money.
Well, yeah.
For money, not just for poets in their own vocational rights, for editors, pro bono. I mean, most of the people I know who've worked in your role, you would be doing over 10,000 hours. I mean, that sounds crazy, but you would have.
Yeah, for sure.
Many of us have been putting in our own we pay from our own modest lives, so that the lacking of the money, but it can change. People always think it's only going to go one way, but you just need a progressive government.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
that can happen.
I've really tried to champion now paying the arts practitioners. It's not a term I necessarily like, but a number of our funding applications have really focused on the excellent masthead that we do have, who are creatively and critically developing the pieces that we do publish. And that's a mandatory part of the process.
Yeah.
And to pay those people too.
Yeah, absolutely.
They are not the people creating the new work, but it's a fundamental cog in the process. And that still is far too quiet. It needs to come to the fore. Far too quiet.
I agree. Well, it's bang on 7 o'clock. Thank you both so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for watching. You can always watch this back as well if you'd like to on our YouTube channel. And please join us for our next session, which will be on Thursday, the 3rd of October. And that will be non-fiction poetry with Jessica Wilkinson, who's been
I didn't realise
mentioned
that.
this evening. Perfect.
Quite a preview.
Good primer. The only thing I would say that's missing, which I just thought I'll clip because I think it's important, is voices of people with different cognitive abilities. I think that's really an area that I would like to see change rapidly in the next 5 to 10 years. They just don't have access.
Yeah.
They sit within siloed programs, which are tremendous, like Writability. Thank you, that's incredible. Writers Victoria. It's an incredible initiative and I support it, but I think that there really needs to be a change in how those voices are brought in to being published. They're writing, but how do we publish them? So I just didn't want to miss that. That was
No, it's important.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
See
I
you.
think we're done. Thank you.